Hello there. In this video, I want to go over an additional video to my domain video. It occurred to me there were some examples I left out, and I wanted to take time to cover those now. So in the previous video, we talked about domain being the set of all inputs or x values that can be mapped to a y value or output in a given domain or range. So for example, say we had, let's see, 3, 4, 5, 6. If I wanted to test to see if 6 was part of the domain, I've got to think, if I draw up or down vertically, do I eventually hit the line? And the answer is yes in this case. So 6 would be part of the domain. But there are infinitely many solutions in almost every example that are part of the domain. So how do we make our answer short and concise? And I'll be reviewing those. So there was interval notation and inequality notation. I'll go over both of those. So for this one, we notice, first of all, we want to discover our starting value, and our starting value is at 2, but if we draw downwards, remember we got an open circle there, and an open circle, it basically means this point doesn't exist. It's a quote-unquote starting point, but at the same time, we can't include that point. So in interval notation, we will take our starting point to be positive 2. So when we don't include the value, we have a positive 2 and then a comma. It's kind of like writing out a coordinate pair, but we're not listing an x and a y, we're listing a set of x values. Now, generally we'd find the other endpoint, but if we notice, when we trace along the graph, there is no right endpoint. It just goes on forever. And this arrow indicates it goes on forever upwards and to the right. So when we don't have an input, we have to think, well, what does it mean to extend forever? What's that concept? It's infinity. So since we don't have an endpoint, we will say this goes to infinity. And we want to think of that every single time we see the arrow. Now, how do we do that with inequality notation? Now, the good news with inequality notation is we don't necessarily need the infinity. Now, there's a couple ways you could write this. One of them is more appropriate. Remember, with inequality, we had 2 inequality symbols on either side of x, with x being in the middle. Our smaller value goes on the left, and our larger value goes on the right. And since we don't include 2, we'll go with equals. We'll go with the absence of equals. And we'll write our 2. Now, another number might go on the right. Since we don't have a number, infinity is not a number, it's just a concept that means goes to infinity, we'll put an infinity symbol. And we always don't use an equal sign with infinity because you can never be equal to infinity. Again, it's not a number. So this is the, I don't want to say more inappropriate way, but I mean, I guess the less technically professional way of writing an inequality. The other way we could write this is just say x is greater than 2. I mean, our domain is set of all x values greater than 2, and we can go on forever and ever and ever. So if you're going to write in inequality notation, use this one. If you're going to write in interval notation, this is how you would write it. And recall that with interval notation, if the value is included, so if 2 had been a solid point, we'd use a bracket next to 2. You would always use a parenthesis next to infinity because we can't include infinity. The same way, if you're writing inequality notation, you would always not use the equal sign. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and look at one more example. Here we've got a little bit of something different going on. This time we've got a right endpoint and no left endpoint. Now this left side of the graph does have the arrow. Now it does seem to be pointing just directly downwards, but we have to remember that with functions, that does include all values going to the left. It may not look like it's going to the left, but it is very ever so slightly going to the left. So when we write this out in interval notation, we're going to start with negative infinity this time, since we're going to infinity in the negative direction. And then we got to look at this little point right here. This is our right endpoint, and we got to trace downwards. That is at -1, so we will stop our interval at -1. Now this time it is a solid point, so we will use the bracket. And if we wanted to write it in inequality notation, we can write it the same as before, except x will now be less than or equal to -1. If you enjoyed that video, give it a like and subscribe to my channel. If you have ideas for future videos, please leave them in the comments section, and I will see you for the next video. Thanks for watching.